I remember that we had read, we had gone through the parallels of the development of philosophy and statecraft in the West under the schools of Plato, the Academy of Athens, and the ideas of agape, of truth, and how to pursue it, the method of reasoning that gave birth to the best of Western civilization, and the parallel growth of a similar modality of thinking about philosophy, truth, and applying it for the betterment of humankind in the Chinese matrix. We look at how this battle over ideas and ideas about ideas and how the mind comes to know ideas shaped a lot of the political developments going beyond Plato's lifetime and Confucius's lifetime and Mencius and his followers throughout the schools of Zen Buddhism, Taoism, which oftentimes were used for political motives to undermine a lot of the Renaissance dynamics of China. We were introduced to some of the philosophers, people who masqueraded as Confucians, but actually were legalists, promoting a very dead formalism that really didn't do a lot of good for anybody. And we had a lot of people as well over the years masquerading as Platonists, but were actually Aristotelians in disguise, doing very similar things, undermining the fabric of Western civilization and the Renaissance principle there. So there's certain similarities, and Mike Billington, I recall, was citing a few China scholars who were high-level British intelligence operatives who were all trying to make the argument that Chinese history as a whole should be read purely from the idea that it's a different way of thinking, that there's a Western logical way of thinking, and then there's this Chinese way of thinking that's incompatible, it's incommensurable with the West. And we shouldn't assume that there's any parallels, even for something like the Song Dynasty, which I remember there was one author that Mike Billington cited who said, it's too difficult of a situation to look at the Song Dynasty, so we're just going to ignore it. Because if you actually did look at that period, you would realize that there's a hell of a lot of similarities to the Renaissance dynamics of the West as well. I remember also we were looking at the Opium Wars a little bit, and the British attempt to just crush the spirit of China on a multitude of levels in the 19th century, along with the French. Is there anything you guys think that should be said for anybody listening as an audience, as a viewer on YouTube who might have missed the last readings?
I would like to say that for Chinese historians, the Song Dynasty is considered the beginning of modern history for Chinese historians, because precisely of that bourgeois-like commercial and urban development.
Okay, that's interesting. So
yes, and it's not only a how can I say it, on the level of the principles, but it's also the urban life with the centers for discussion, for exchange of ideas, and there were many contact with the outside worlds because of the maritime Silk Road at the moment. So during the Tang Dynasty, it was more the land, the Silk Road, and the maritime Silk Road to a certain extent too. But during the Song Dynasty, it was primarily the maritime Silk Road.
Okay, that's interesting. All right, so then let's begin that, and let's go on until 10 o'clock. Jerry, would you like to start the first section? You're on mute, by the way.
Okay. Yeah, I had to just switch back. I'm reading it on the other page. Okay. British cultural warfare. 19th century China must rank as among the ugliest chapters in Britain's black history of colonial looting and genocide. Lord Palmerston's career was marked by 3 acts of barbarism towards China, 2 opium wars, and the Taiping Rebellion. totally justifying the frequent Chinese use of the term barbarian to describe foreigners. After the First Opium War, the spread of opium and poverty across the south of China gave rise to a peasant revolt, the Taiping Rebellion, in the late 1840s. These were the years of Palmerston Zoo, as Lyndon LaRouche has described it. That is, Palmerston's sponsorship through especially Giuseppe Mazzini of radical terrorist blood and soil movements throughout the Western world. These proto-fascist, ethnic and religious-based movements functioned on behalf of the British Foreign Office, just as the global terror apparatus today is headquartered in London. There is no better example of this policy than the British sponsorship of the Taiping Rebellion, which succeeded in reducing China's population by several tens of millions, while placing the country's economy under British control. The Taiping were programmed by British intelligence as an ostensibly Christian opposition to the supposedly oppressive heathen ideology of Confucianism. Broad leeway was permitted, of course, so that the leader of the Taiping movement could maintain his belief that he was the second son of God, the brother of Christ, while at the same time his religious views were essentially a mishmash of Taoist beliefs in Christian trappings. The foremost case officer for this British religious training was none other than James Legge, whose bowdlerized translation of the Confucian classics are still used as the standard today. I just want to say I'm laughing here because I was trying to find some translations of Shu Si, and I think I sent I sent Matt James Legge's translation is the one I found.
It's like trying to find a Plato translation that's not Benjamin Jowett.
Yeah, but in the introduction it says James Legge was a admirer of Zhu Si. So, yeah, it's a good thing we're reading this. Mike has done his homework. Okay, scrap that thing I sent you, Matt.
I'll still read out of curiosity.
Okay. Continuing. The rebellion was heavily armed by British merchants, as the Taiping conquered most of southern China with incredible carnage and nearly took Beijing. The British officially supported the Qing dynasty officials in Beijing, but made no secret of their sponsorship of the Taiping, demanding that the government grant ever greater powers to the British or face a Taiping Christian takeover. The pace of Christian concessions
Chinese.
Pardon?
The pace of Chinese concessions.
Okay. The pace of Chinese concessions was too slow for Lord Palmerston's imperial taste, but he was unwilling to give up the considerable control the British enjoyed over the Qing government. Rather than permitting a Taiping victory, he chose instead to launch another direct military assault against the Chinese government, this time against Beijing itself. Although even the British Parliament balked at this second Opium War, Palmerston eventually got his way, laying waste to much of the royal estates in Beijing. Upon the total capitulation of Beijing, London then deployed British mercenaries to join the Chinese armies in destroying the disintegrating Taiping forces, adding more millions to the death toll. As a footnote number 40.
That just says the British mercenaries were led by Chinese Gordon, who later met his due in the British efforts to seize the Sudan.
Chinese Gordon. Okay. China was essentially now placed under British control, but without the necessity of a military occupation. In order to ensure an undisrupted supply of loot, huge war indemnities were imposed on the Chinese for daring to oppose the free trade in Indian opium. The Chinese Customs Bureau was placed under the control of the British, who simply seized debt and war reparations payments before passing on the remaining crumbs to Beijing. Customs Bureau control passed in 1863 to the infamous Sir Robert Hart, who over the next 48 years was the effective Governor General for the economy of semi-colonial China. He eventually took over the administration of most internal taxes and revenues, in addition to the customs on foreign trade. The greatest danger to British rule in China was the failure of Palmerston's Confederacy gambit to destroy the United States in the U.S. Civil War. The British feared that the ideas of the American Revolution, the Renaissance concept of a nation-state predicated on the view of man in the image of God, would break through the British ideological blockade of China. The British knew the American system ideas could find a resonance in the tradition of Confucius, Mencius, and Zhu Xi. Countermeasures were deployed. The task was twofold. On the one hand, introduce the Chinese to the Aristotelian tradition of the Enlightenment philosophers, especially the British empiricists and social Darwinists. Seek out in Chinese culture those tendencies coherent with the Enlightenment view of man as a beast, and of science as no more than empiricist data collection and syllogistic computation. They found what they needed in legalism, Taoism, and the Taoist-leaning distortions introduced into Confucianism by such as Chunzi and Wang Yangming. The second aspect of British cultural warfare was even more essential. Conceal or distort all reference to the Platonic Renaissance tradition in the West, and convince the Chinese that the development of modern science and technology came not from the Platonic scientific method, but from the empiricism of the Enlightenment. The works of Leonardo, Kepler, and Leibniz were to be ignored, or, when that proved impossible, distorted. To this end, the British picked up a bright young Chinese scholar, Yen Fu, and sent him to London in 1877. There, he was indoctrinated in British radical empiricism, which was presented as the endpoint of all Western thought. He learned nothing of the science of Leibniz and his collaborators in Europe and America, nor of the ongoing efforts of American, German, and Russian leaders to carry out the development of the Eurasian heartland. He became a rabid defender of amorality in science, in statecraft, and in economics, preaching the code of wealth and power as the only criteria for truth. In defense of Adam Smith's advocacy of unbridled greed, Yen Fu wrote, quote, "There may be those who say that, according to Smith's book, human morality is nothing more than a matter of self-interest and the pursuit of profit, and that the principle of heaven will be lost. What they do not understand is that science concerns itself with questions of truth and falsehood, and not with whether its findings coincide with benevolence and righteousness. And there's a footnote, big one, footnote 41, if someone wants to read that.
Okay, I'm going to read that. Confer Adam Smith's The Theory of the Moral Sentiment, 1799. The administration of the great system of the universe, the care of the universal happiness of all rational and sensible beings, is the business of God and not of man. To man is allotted a much humbler department, but one much more suitable to the weakness of his powers and to the narrowness of his comprehension, the care of his own happiness and of his family, his friends, his country. But though we are endowed with a very strong desire of those ends, it has been entrusted the slow and uncertain determination of our reason to find out the proper means of bringing them about. Nature has directed us to the greater part of these by original and immediate instincts. Hunger, thirst, the passion which unites the two sexes, love, pleasure, and dread of pain, prompts to apply those means for their own sakes, and without any consideration of the tendency to those beneficent ends which the great director of nature intended produced by them. Emphasis added.
Okay.
Right.
To the delight of his British sponsors, Yen Fu launched a brutal assault on Confucianism in favor of legalism and Taoism, which, he wrote, are the only views compatible with the views of Darwin, Montesquieu, and Spencer. He particularly defended the legalist Han Feizi, the most famous student of China's Aristotle, Chunzi. Yen Fu spent his life translating the works of the British empiricists and social Darwinists, while, not surprisingly, maintaining his lifelong opium addiction. His translation of this Aristotelian pantheon, many of whom were directly employed by the British East India Company itself, became the primary source of knowledge concerning Western thought for the Chinese intellectuals at the turn of the century, including Mao Zedong and others who founded the Communist Party of China.
Okay.
The American System and Dr. Sun Yat-sen.
So do we want to switch the readers to Nick or Quan?
Okay. You want to keep on?
Pardon?
I'm happy to read.
You want me to keep going?
Oh, yeah. Jerry, if you want to keep going, you can go.
You can do
Okay.
one more section, Jerry, yeah, and then we'll just keep a rotation. Maybe everybody does 3 sections each or something.
Okay. I don't mind.
Can I stop to make a comment on it?
Of course.
Yes.
Did you guys hear that? Because I don't know if my microphone is working. Did you hear that?
Yeah.
Yep.
So I just wanted to say that this article that you brought, man, it looks very well documented. I rarely find articles like this, and I really like how he connects many points. Like he was talking about Nietzsche a little bit above, and it seems very unconventional. It seems very creative. And the author, he seems to be connecting many of the things that I normally I wouldn't find in a typical history book. So I struggle a lot to find this on my own. But that's it. That's all I had.
No, yeah, thank you for that comment. No, and I agree that's why I wanted us to really just focus on this particular writing, because Mike Billington does what most geopolitical analysts fail to do when he's looking at current events, which is to take a deep context going back thousands of years into a battle of ideas, and he's looking at the philosophical ideas that shaped history. Whereas most people are materialists and they try to find material mechanisms to account for why a civilization grew or collapsed or went to war. They fall short because these are the material actions that these popular geopoliticians often talk about are simply themselves the effects of concepts and a battle over concepts that they're not looking at. So Mike Billington was very sensitive to that when he began his analysis. So it's very, yeah, he's touching on something which most people don't look at.
Oh yeah, thank you for that. So please continue. Yeah, feel free to do that.
Sure.
Okay. The American System and Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And on the left is a map of China, Dr. Sun's plan for China's development, an integrated system of railways, water projects, and other infrastructure programs. It looks quite amazing. Okay, continuing. There was an entirely different process taking place in the West, in direct opposition to the British empire building and to the British ideology of empiricism and libertinism. During the same years Yen Fu was in England, the late 1870s, the leaders of the American system of political economy within the United States, based in Philadelphia, were building a political alliance with leading Germans, Russians, and others to develop the entire Eurasian continent and to crush the genocidal British Empire. These were the same individuals, led by the world's foremost economist, Henry Carey, who had guided Abraham Lincoln in the industrialization of the northern states and the defeat of the British-sponsored slavocracy in the Confederate South. These Republican leaders planned the extension of American system methods worldwide to bring about the industrialization of Asia, Africa, and South America. The year before Yen Fu's arrival in London, the British launched a series of attacks in the London Times on Henry Carey and the American system of political economy. The Times complained that Carey's ideas were being repeated in hundreds of magazines and newspapers and were held by multitudes. This was leading to a rejection of free trade, even by some European leaders, complained the Times. Free trade was, it said, the cardinal doctrine of English political economy, to question which must indicate ignorance or imbecility. Carey used the opportunity of this diatribe to counterattack, publishing a pamphlet entitled Commerce, Christianity, and Civilization versus British Free Trade, letters in reply to the London Times. The pamphlet was to become a leading organizing weapon internationally, and especially in Germany, against the British Empire. Carey pointed out that every nation governed by British free trade economics had been driven into ruin, while even England itself only sustained a small layer, the oligarchical elite, relegating the working population to barbaric conditions of life. The bulk of the pamphlet, however, was a devastating exposure of the horror of Britain's rape of China. The opium trade, sanctioned by the royal head of the English Church, became the means of enslavement of the Chinese people, despite England's official opposition to the slave trade. There is no slavery on earth, wrote Carey, to be compared with the bondage into which opium casts its victims. He acknowledged that some Chinese scholars, the Han-learning scholars, advised the emperor to legalize and cultivate opium, using the excuse that there was no other way to stop the outflow of silver to the British opium dealers. But Carey also quoted the Qing emperor's famous rejection of that proposal, that nothing will induce me to derive a revenue from the vice and misery of my people.
Wow. Hey, can I just ask, Quan, which emperor would that have been that Henry C. Carey was citing at that moment?
Okay, it was 1839, I'm sorry, when he sent Governor General Lin Zexu to kick out the opium boxes in the harbor of Guangzhou. So 1839 would be Emperor Dao Guang, Daoguang.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
And that pamphlet is available online, by the way, on archive.org. I'll put that in the description box to this video when it's on YouTube, so people can access Henry C. Carey's original essay.
Okay. Good. Okay. While Yen Fu was translating John Stuart Mill's major works, which became the economic standard in China for Western economics, Carey was denouncing Mill as the theoretical architect of colonial looting and mass murder. Mill was a leading official of the East India Company, in charge of relations with the native states during the years of both opium wars in China. He was a dedicated Aristotelian from the age of 12 and a follower of Jeremy Bentham and Adam Smith. Carey quoted Mill, "Political economy considers mankind as occupied solely in acquiring and consuming wealth, except in the degree in which desire for wealth is checked by aversion to labor and the desire of the present enjoyment of costly indulgences." Carey responded that Mill's political economy presents for our consideration a mere brute animal, to find a name for which it desecrates the word man, which was previously recognized as expressing the idea of a being made in the likeness of its creator. And what, we may ask, is the value of an analytic process that selects only the material parts of man, those that are common to himself and the beast, and excludes those which are common to the angels and himself? In the 1880s, Wharton Barker, a Philadelphia industrialist and the publisher of Henry Carey's writings, worked with Tsar Alexander II, the liberator of the serfs in Russia, to build ships and industrialize Russia. He explicitly stated the goal: the accomplishment of the common work of Russia and America, namely the dismemberment of the British Empire. Barker and his associates proposed the construction of single-gauge rail lines across Russia and into China, breaking the stranglehold on trade held by the British Navy. Having completed the Great Transcontinental Railroad in the United States, their ambition was to girdle the globe with a tramway of iron, as one of many great deeds which tend to advance civilization and develop the material wealth of people. Such development was viewed as a casus belli by the British, who could maintain their colonial looting process only if subject nations were kept isolated, divided, and backward. When Wharton Barker in the 1880s and again in the 1890s negotiated directly with the Chinese government to build railroads and telephone and telegraph lines across China into Central Asia and Europe, the British government directly intervened to sabotage the deals. The British permitted other nations to build railroads in China, but only as a means of extracting minerals and other raw materials. Each rail line, generally running from the coast to a source of mineral wealth in the interior, was constructed with a different gauge, preventing internal trade and communications. It's just interesting because that's exactly what the British did in Africa as well.
Mm-hmm.
The only railroads were from the mine to the port. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
There was no interlinking of nations. Okay, continuing. Barker also attempted to circumvent the British control of the Chinese economy, encouraging Beijing to establish a national bank along American system lines to finance internal improvements. The Chinese-American Bank was established to place government loans from both governments into rail construction and other infrastructure. Eventually, these efforts were also undermined by the British. The American system of political economy, of which Carey and Barker were advocates, was based on the ideas of Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, and their international collaborators. It derived directly from Leibniz, who had discovered the science of physical economy, from the recognition that the strength of a nation rests on the increase in the productivity of its labor. The measure of productivity was not how much could be squeezed out of each worker, but the rate of replacement of brute force by heat-powered machines, and the increased capacity through classical education of the citizenry to discover and assimilate new technologies. Following Leibniz, the American founding fathers recognized that the source of progress was not located in military power, colonial looting, or in the immoral libertinism of Adam Smith's invisible hand dealing opium, but in the creative potential of each individual human mind to discover new truths about man and nature, or to reproduce such discoveries by others. Alexander Hamilton formulated the policies required by a republic to enhance national development and individual creative potential, including a national bank as opposed to a private central bank, protective tariffs, and government-sponsored infrastructure projects.
The citation simply refers to about 6 amazing papers, footnote 45.
These ideas guided the United States through its 3 wars of independence from Britain: the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the American Civil War. In the late 19th century, Henry Carey and his Philadelphia-based associates continued this tradition, creating an international movement which carried the American system battle against the British Empire to every corner of the world. The fact that the history of this movement is now virtually unknown, even in the United States, is characteristic of the falsification of history in the 20th century by the apologists of the Enlightenment. In the case of China, a single man schooled in the American system of political economy discovered and exposed the fraud behind the British portrayal of Western thought as Enlightenment empiricism, and broke the back of the British imperial power in China. That man, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, was educated in Hawaii in the 1880s by the family of Frank Damon, who played a leading role in the work of the Philadelphia circles of Henry Carey in the United States, in Germany, and in Asia. Damon provided the young Chinese nationalists with a sensuous grasp of the totally opposite worldviews competing within the West, characterized politically by the opposing American and British systems. Sun Yat-sen utilized this understanding of universal history, together with his own study and insight into Chinese history and culture, to present to the world as a whole a penetrating analysis of the evil of the British Empire and its ideological roots. He also presented a unique method for reversing the ongoing collapse of Western civilization through cooperation in the development of China. The International Development of China, written by Sun in 1919, accused the Western nations of driving themselves into global recession and the war to end all wars by failing to act on the basis of the correct ideas. Sun identified those correct ideas as precisely those of Alexander Hamilton and the U.S. Constitution as against the British system. Even within the United States, Sun pointed to the difference between Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, whereby Hamilton's federalism, rather than Jefferson's libertarianism, lay at the root of the American system. The United States wealth and power, Sun wrote, have not come only from the independence and self-government of the original states, but rather from the progress in unified government which followed federation of the states.
It's a link to Sun Yat-sen's 3 Principles of the People, also available on archive.org.
By unifying under the Constitution, said Sun, the new republic attained the strength to defend against British free trade policies, which aimed at preventing the development of domestic U.S. industries. Sun wrote, quote, "It was thought by the economists of the Adam Smith School that competition was a beneficent factor and a sound economic system. But modern economists discovered that it is a very wasteful and ruinous system. It has been discovered by post-Darwin philosophers that the primary force of human evolution is cooperation and not struggle, as that of the animal world." Sun's International Development of China was a detailed expansion of the concepts presented by Henry Carey and Wharton Barker, including extensive rail and canal systems crisscrossing the whole of China, extending into South Asia and through Russia into Europe, coupled with rapid national industrialization. His aim was not just the transformation of China, but of the world as a whole. This plan, he wrote, must be a practical solution for the three great world questions, which are the international war, the commercial war, and class war. Sun's polemics against Adam Smith, J.S. Mill, and the Darwinians ran counter to nearly all prevailing opinion in China during the ferment of the early 20th century. Both the reformers and the radicals generally accepted the lie that British empiricist ideology was the only alternative to the old thinking, which they believed was responsible for the economic and social decay in China. Sun Yat-sen had converted to Christianity, but believed passionately in the coherence of Christianity.
Let's play our phone.
Confucianism while adopting the leaders of the reform movement in the 1890s and early 20th century, Kang Yu-wei, 1858 to 1927, and his associate Liangshu, Zhao, 1873 to 1929, even proposed the adoption of Confucianism as a state religion under the emperor. Yet their philosophic arguments totally cohere with the materialist and utilitarian ideology of British empiricism. They simply proposed a Chinese version of the Enlightenment. Sun Yat-sen confronted Kang and his supporters not only on their refusal to give up reliance upon the monarchical system, but also on their acceptance of the Darwinian view of man. Kang Yu-wei's view of Confucianism was, not surprisingly, derived from Han learning. Kang believed the emperor was essential to rule China, just as he viewed the rites as rules of conduct required to control the people, rules derived ultimately from the Son of Heaven, the emperor, rather than from heaven itself, as Mencius had insisted. Sun Yat-sen's concept of a republican government rested upon a higher hypothesis of man and nature, while the reformers refused to part with their familiar failed assumptions. Sun Yat-sen was just as uncompromising with the radicals and the emerging Marxist ideologues. This became even more critical after 1919, when the British, with President Wilson's full support, sold out their Chinese allies from World War I by maintaining and expanding the colonial spheres of interest in China by the major powers. This sparked a massive resistance movement within China, known as the May 4th movement, which included the emergence of various Marxist study groups. Sun argued that the Marxists and the new Soviet Republic, although they had identified some of the evils of the existing social and economic order, had not broken from the underlying axioms of the British view of man as a beast. The Marxist scientific materialism, Sun said, does not break from the Hobbesian view of man battling one against all in a hostile world. the social Darwinist survival of the fittest. Sun wrote in his lectures on the three principles of the people, quote, "Class war is not the cause of social progress. It is a disease developed in the course of social progress." What Marx gained through his studies of social programs was a knowledge of diseases in the course of social progress. Therefore, Marx can only be called a social pathologist, not a social physiologist. That's hilarious. In his The Vital Problem of China, written in 1917, Sun specifically identified the root of Marxism in the Enlightenment ideology of the rule of might. European civilization during the last several hundred years is one of scientific materialism, the cult of force. While the Marxists were sincerely concerned about poverty and oppression, they were ignoring the fundamental problem of the creation of wealth, which came about only through enhancing and mobilizing the creative powers of the entire nation, what Sun called the law of social progress. The young Marxists, he wrote in his lectures, failed to realize that China is suffering from poverty, not from unequal distribution of wealth.
Cool.
Uh,
Any thoughts before we go on to the next section or questions? Okay.
Maybe a short comment. The program by Sun Yat-sen is now being realized by Xi Jinping.
Well said. Yeah. If you look at the actual international development of China program, all the Three Gorges Dam, the rail, the ports, all of these things that Sun Yat-sen laid out in 1920, like Quan said, it really is, these projects are unfolding very quickly. Most of them have already been built under Xi Jinping in the Belt and Road Initiative today.
Exactly. And the more than 20,000 kilometers of high-speed rail too.
Mm-hmm. As a quick side note, there's an interesting piece of information that we came across recently looking at the Bretton Woods Conference and how when these different nations of the world were presenting the development plans that they would like to bring to their parts of the world, whether it was in South America and the South American delegation or the Chinese delegation or the Eastern European or the Indians, everyone had brought these programs modeled on the best of the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt. Rural electrification, big infrastructure. In the Chinese delegation, at the time they were representing Chiang Kai-shek, right, in 1944, but they brought the development plans of Sun Yat-sen, and they had been endorsed openly by also Mao and Zhou Enlai, as well as Chiang Kai-shek of the Kuomintang. So you had a consensus that if the United States were to follow through on the promise of Franklin Roosevelt on the four freedoms and actually internationalize the New Deal, then the question becomes, would the Chinese Civil War have even been necessitated? Would that have happened? Or would there have been a higher unifying principle of development that could have overcome those types of problems that were being, promulgated by a lot of British intelligence and Western intelligence operations as well, to create a breakup of China? So the fun point of what could have been, to let the mind play with.
Yeah. It's interesting that last quote of Sun's, that China is suffering from poverty, not from unequal distribution of wealth. Mm-hmm. And you look at today and the Chinese government's commitment to the eradication of poverty, extreme poverty in China, which I think they say they've done. It directly connects with Sun's quote there too.
Yeah, the whole idea of creation, you have to learn, you have to focus on creating wealth, what Henry and Hamilton did. But Marx never did that. It was just presumed that there was this wealth, and it was just all of the causes of injustice were just the misattribution of wealth into the hands of a few. And he never really dealt with how does the mind actually create wealth through discoveries and inventions and getting outside of closed systems. Marx never dealt with that.
He just studied Jesus.
I was going to say something that is the main problem that I see, which is not, it's not something that hasn't been said already, but it's just an interesting point, that is the problem with focusing on just distributing wealth. While that sounds like a good idea, it just breaks up the incentives that that people initially had to actually create the wealth for others to see in the first place. So that, like, they don't conceive that first you need the incentive, and then a few years later you're going to see the wealth. But then you can complain about that it was not properly distributed, because what preceded it was the incentives, and without it you wouldn't even see the wealth.
Yeah. Yeah, not to say that that social safety nets and welfare programs are a bad thing. They could be a necessary and good thing. They are a good thing and necessary at various times, but they're not the cause of wealth. And simply redistributing wealth is not going to end injustice. It's especially when you're in a situation of scarcity and there isn't enough wealth anyway. As it is, you have to get into a new paradigm. Yeah. So who wants to read Sun's 3 principles as rights?
I'll take this one on.
Do it.
If I may.
Please do.
Sun's 3 principles as rights. It is useful to view Dr. Sun Yat-sen's extraordinary contribution to China and to the world as an extension of the historic battle concerning the rights. Although Sun seldom referred to the rights per se, he followed Shuzi in identifying the great learning from the Book of Rights as the core of China's best moral and intellectual tradition. In the opening pages of his published lectures from 1917 to 1919, in which he introduces his concept of the 3 principles of the people, Sun writes, "We must revive not only our old morality, but also our old learning, the great learning. Search into the nature of things, extend the boundaries of knowledge, make the purpose sincere, regulate the mind, cultivate personal virtue, rule the family, govern the state, pacify the world." He expanded upon China's responsibility as called for in the Great Learning. Let us pledge to lift ourselves up, let us pledge ourselves to lift up the fallen and to aid the weak. Then, when we become strong and look back upon our own sufferings under the political and economic domination of the powers, and see weaker and smaller peoples undergoing similar treatment, we will rise and smite that imperialism. Then we will be truly governing the state and pacifying the world. To Sun, this is the true meaning of the rights, universal principles based on natural law, whose comprehension is necessary to assure the progress of humanity. He approached the formulation of his own organizing principles from precisely that worldview. His 3 principles of the people are an updated form of the rights based upon the same Confucian view that man is worthy and capable of governing himself according to the noble precepts. The 3 principles are: 1. National sovereignty, 2. Republican government, and 3. The general welfare of the people. Sun himself emphasized that the formulation of these 3 principles as a single concept was inspired by Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. The first principle nationalism or national sovereignty, was Lincoln's government of the people. The second, the rights of the people, or the republican form of participatory government, was government by the people. And the third, the people's livelihood, or the general welfare, was government for the people. Taken together, wrote Sun, these three principles are identical with Confucius's hope for a great commonwealth. A glance at the preamble to the US Constitution and the Great Learning, see page 39, demonstrates the coherence in type between the rights, the constitutional principles of the American system, and Sun's three principles of the people. Sun also specifically identified the psychological problems which could potentially block the Chinese from embracing and implementing these three principles. He saw the greatest danger in the influence of British radical liberalism among the leaders of the May 4th movement, which influence was under the personal direction of Bertrand Russell, London's foremost psychological warrior. A group intoxicated with the new culture, Sun wrote, have begun to reject the old morality, saying that the former makes the latter unnecessary. They say there are no princes in a democracy, so loyalty is not needed and can be cast aside, including loyalty to the nation and to the people. Sun, like Henry Carey before him, singled out John Stuart Mill for particular criticism, denouncing his advocacy of extreme individual liberty, which, Sun warned, would soon become unrestrained license. Such libertinism would destroy the national cohesion required for social progress, he warned, and the Chinese people shall become a sheet of loose sand. While Sun viewed the rights and his three principles as expressions of natural law rather than codified rules of conduct derived from custom, he nonetheless argued that a modern nation-state required a formal constitution in order to establish the rule of law over the arbitrary rule of men. But such a constitution must be of a universal nature, embodying moral principles and fundamental human rights, as in the three principles, as guides to social progress and individual creative development. Only then could there be a true republic, a Confucian great commonwealth.
Great. Beautiful.
Yeah, it really is.
Mm-hmm.
And Mike writes it beautifully.
Mm-hmm. So Nick, yeah, you can keep reading. It was a short little section. The image here is Bertrand Russell, and it says here Bertrand Russell, along with Nietzschean cultural pessimists Liangshu and Hu Shi, and then a public disgrace during the Cultural Revolution. Probably mispronounced their names.
Lucian looks like a happy guy, doesn't he?
He does. Yeah, looks can be deceiving, eh?
Yeah. Shall I continue?
Yeah.
So, Bertrand Russell, anti-Aristotle Aristotelian. The Republican Revolution of 1911, led by Sun Yat-sen, threw a scare into the British. The revolution was not entirely successful, in that Sun Yat-sen was forced to strike a deal with the head of the Qing dynasty army, Yuan Shikai, who pledged to adhere to the Republican Constitution. With British backing, Yuan broke that pledge, of course, and even attempted to declare himself emperor. Although that effort failed, the result of Yuan's sabotage of the Republic was the division of China into regions governed by competing warlords. The British were pleased with Yuan Shikai, and even more with the era of the warlords, since the divided China served to protect their interests. However, they knew that Sun Yat-sen's influence threatened the entire Asian branch of the empire or more. During World War I, London was unable to apply much energy to its Asian problems, although it utilized its imperial alliance with Japan to keep China destabilized. Sun Yat-sen's networks of support in Japan were successfully cut off. Following the war, the British moved full force to contain Sun's influence, including the sponsorship of various radical opposition figures and organizations. This followed the pattern of Lord Palmerston's Zoo. As in Palmerston's day, such radical movements were designed as anti-authoritarian, while not departing from the empiricist Enlightenment view of man, nor from the view of political economy as a Darwinian struggle among beasts over fixed resources. To run this effort in 20th century China, London sent two experts in psychological profiling and manipulation, their own Lord Bertrand Russell and their colonial asset from America, John Dewey. Still today, the combined names of Russell and Dewey are known throughout China as the primary source of Western influence in modern China. The sellout of China at the Versailles Conference in 1919 had been forecast by Sun Yat-sen in his The Vital Problem of China, where he warned against China joining the war on the British side. Sun predicted that China's support for the British would simply encourage them to chop China into various pieces as prizes to the stronger nations which helped London destroy Germany. This was in keeping, Sun wrote, with the balance of power mentality of British geopolitics. When another country is strong enough to be utilized, Britain sacrifices her own allies to satisfy its desires. But when that country becomes too weak to be of any use to herself, she sacrifices it to please other countries. He compared British relations toward its allies to that of a silk farmer to his silkworms. After all, the silk has been drawn from the cocoons. They are destroyed by fire or used as fishwood. Versailles was total confirmation of Sun's insight. To the British, Sun's international development of China represented the greatest single threat in the world. The US was safely in the hands of Anglophile racist Woodrow Wilson, of a re-emergence of American system ideas and programs. Sun represented both the humanist Xu tradition of Chinese Confucianism and the Platonic Christian tradition of the Western Renaissance, a dangerous combination which required the best weapons in the British ideological arsenal. Both Russell and Dewey were deployed to China for extended visits in the heyday of the May 4th ferment in 1920 and 21. Russell and Dewey should be seen as the first deconstructionists in China, whose mission was to create an anti-rational alternative of the type so admired by many of today's China scholars. Russell's diatribes against reason and morality and those of Dewey against classical education were already well known in China through translations prepared by the circles around Yen Fu. Russell's sojourn in China was sponsored by the Anti-Religious Society. He immediately projected his hatred of Christianity into the Chinese context, blaming China's backwardness not on 80 years of British looting, but on Confucianism. He attacked the Confucian tradition and the Chinese tendency to admire the scientific progress of the West, but he otherwise admired the Chinese for being backward, passive, and content, the noble savage so beloved by British colonialism. I wonder why. Instructive happiness, or joy of life, is one of the most important goods that we have lost through industrialism. Its commonness in China is a strong reason for thinking well of Chinese civilization. Progress and efficiency, for example, make no appeal to the Chinese, except for those who have come under Western influence. By valuing progress and efficiency, we have secured power and wealth. By ignoring them, the Chinese, until we brought disturbance, secured on the whole a peaceable existence and a life full of enjoyment. Russell admired Taoism for its rejection of universal truths and its anti-scientific doctrine that man must accept nature as it is, denying the Christian and Confucian belief in man's creative powers to know and to change the world. He ascribed this Taoist tradition to the Chinese as a whole, claiming that this was the cause of their admirable pacifism, rooted in their contemplative outlook and in the fact that they do not desire to change whatever they see. They have not the ideal of progress which dominates the Western nations. He even praised the legalist Qin Shi Huang for burning the classics and murdering the Confucian scholars. He quoted approvingly from a Chinese historian, "No radical change can take place in China without encountering the opposition of the literati. This was no less the case then than it is now. Something had to be done to silence the voice of antiquity." Russell also praised Bolshevism as a convenient method to silence the voice of antiquity. He introduced both Marx and Lenin in his classes in Beijing and Shanghai, while arguing that Bolshevism should never succeed in Western Europe. He considered it to be ideal for China's stage of development. Russell's answer to the controversy of the rights was to abolish the rights altogether. The pseudo-anti-Aristotelian solution which throws out the baby with the bathwater. The rights, he insisted, are nothing but trivial points of etiquette whose only concern is to teach people how to behave correctly on various occasions. Russell rejected both natural law and positive law, or rules of conduct. There is one traditional Chinese belief which dies hard, he wrote, and that is the belief that correct ethical sentiments are more important than detailed scientific knowledge. Russell was one of the earliest proponents of the postmodern radical Aristotelianism, which argued that science was a Western phenomenon which were best placed under severe restraints, while Eastern thought was inherently anti-scientific. China, he wrote, in return for our scientific knowledge, may give us something of her large tolerance and contemplative peace of mind. To Russell, our scientific knowledge was not the discovery of new principles underlying the laws of nature and human society, but an Aristotelian compilation of empirical data. Russell's great contribution to science was his collaboration with Alfred North Whitehead in the gigantic failure called the Principia Mathematica, in which they attempted to reduce all of mathematics to a fixed set of axioms and a fixed set of logical rules of transformation. Their intention was to establish proof that all mathematics, and by extension the human mind, functioned as a closed and complete axiomatic system like a computer. Of course, virtually every great scientist, including especially Nicholas of Cusa, Kepler, Leibniz, Cantor, and Feynman, had proven that such an undertaking were inherently incapable of success. Russell's historical writings had a particularly deleterious effect in China, since his books on the history of philosophy and science became a standard source on Western thought. Leibniz, in particular, the West's greatest friend and most profound analyst of China's philosophic contributions, was slandered by Russell as the champion of ignorance and obscurantism. His ideas were totally distorted, then dismissed as a relic of the past, and historical curiosity with no relevance in the new age of enlightenment. Russell subjected the entire Platonic Christian tradition in the West to similar lies and slanders, while glorifying the Aristotelians and the insidious nihilism and perversity of Friedrich Nietzsche's and the emerging existentialist cult. Russell's Nietzschean intentions towards China were quite openly pronounced. China needs a period of anarchy in order to work out her salvation. Although Dewey maintained a formal distinction between his American pragmatism and the Hobbesian and Nietzschean radicalism of Russell, the Chinese have historically and correctly linked the two men as common source of knowledge on Western thought. Dewey, a professor at Columbia University, had instructed several young Chinese scholars in his deconstruction of classical methods of education in favor of a learn through doing variety of pragmatism. He was deployed to China directly by the Morgan banking interests, London's primary control of the US economy and ideology, serving as a journalist for the Morgan-spawned New Republic magazine during his several years' stay in Beijing. These same Morgan interests simultaneously sponsored both British free trade policies and the emerging Communist Party apparatus in Europe, the United States, and Asia.
Well, yeah, that's a new approach to history, eh?
Yep. It's massive.
Yeah.
There's some funny parts in there.
Funny parts? Like what?
I don't know, it just made me chuckle, like, just, I don't know. He's like got this underlying, there's something sarcastic or like.
Yeah, there's a dry humor sort of.
Sometimes, and it's actually really like common British. It's kind of funny. It's really nice. I love reading this paper. Yeah.
When I read London's primary control over the U.S. economy and ideology, when he referred to by the Morgan banking interest, that actually surprised me because I thought that Morgan was a little bit more independent. I just thought that he was cooperating with London and not truly submitted to London in a way that this suggested.
No, actually, the House of Morgan itself, J.P. Morgan, as we know it, was a London bank created in 1853. And it was then brought into the United States in 1854 as a tool with a lot of financial backing from the city, which is sort of the center of world finance then, and it has been the center ever since, to gobble up and try to take control of railroads, a lot of the industry, and run it into the ground. JP Morgan always maintained a manor in London as well. They sort of, if you look at the inner mannerisms of the U.S. Eastern establishment families, like John Pierpont Morgan and that whole club, they make themselves off of British ethics. They're totally beholden to the higher nobility that runs the show in Europe.
Oh, that was great, man.
Yeah, it's a useful thing to keep in mind when you analyze history. A lot of people try to project it all as an American empire, and they miss that higher dynamic.
Yeah, it's very important. It's essential. Yeah, the British.
That was great.
Yeah, it's important to be aware of, especially in these cultural aspects, like the way they work on people subliminally, and yeah, it's very powerful stuff. But once you're aware of it, you see it like everywhere. I mean, it's in all the media, it's in the intelligentsia as well, in the universities. It's overrun with this kind of constant attack against the human creative source. Like it's a constant. It's very tiring for people, as you can see. Like the culture suffers greatly with it. I mean, look at art today. It's really going through almost a dark age. So yeah.
Well, and the creation of these false dualisms, because the empire has always used the formula of creating these false dualities of left and right to get their slaves to fight, and by creating this monetarist, Darwinian free trade political economy on one extreme, they were then able to also create a false opposite that a lot of people fell into as a net. Which is interesting to see how the JP Morgan banking interests were also funding the growth of Marxism, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia to overthrow the czars. They were funding it also in the growth of this in China and even inside of the United States itself.
Oh my God, Matt, that is really documented. Like you have like evidence of that. Is that really actually easy?
Yeah, that's highly documented. Yeah, Trotsky's
Oh, okay.
receipt of Rothschild and Rockefeller
Yeah.
No problem.
funding and Morgan funding for the revolution as a color revolution to
Uh-huh.
destabilize Russia. Yeah, that was, and also the
Okay.
Yale Skull and Bones apparatus in China was very big around this time too.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the whole kidnapping of Sun Yat-sen took place in London. Like, all of that stuff too.
Right in the
Like,
1890s, eh? Yeah,
yeah, like broad daylight. I mean, they beat him black and blue. Like, yeah.
yeah, as if British intelligence didn't know about that or sanctions.
Oh, right. Yeah, of course. The Five Eyes only see what they wish to see. Like Aristotle, they're like, only what's right in front of you. Don't look for anything else. So we
Oh, what are we at? We're at 9:30. We have 30 minutes left. We might actually finish this paper. Wow.
There's potential. We got 9 pages left.
And some of it might be appendix. Okay. Do you want to read another section or do we want to go for Quan?
Quan's good to go. I can take a pause.
Quan, what do you feel?
Okay, that's okay.
Or Cynthia. Okay, yeah.
Okay, so I would take on China's cultural pessimist. 3 exemplary case studies. To trace the influence of Russell and Dewey, let us examine the work of 3 leading figures of 20th century China. Hu Shi, 1891 to 1962, the leading Chinese advocate of John Dewey's American pragmatism, and later China's ambassador to the US during the crucial years of World War II. Lu Xun, 1881 to 1936, China's foremost writer of the May 4th period, and Liangshu Ming, 1893 to 1994, a leading Confucian scholar who promoted the worst of both Eastern and Western irrationalism and helped to create the environment which led to the horrors of the great proletarian cultural revolution. First case, Hu Shi. Hu Shi was educated in Shanghai's progressive schools, reading the Yanfu translation of John Stuart Mill, Huxley, Montesquieu, and Spencer. I will read note 52. Much of the following material on Hu Shi was researched by Robert Vassar in his Hu Shi and the British Deployment versus the Chinese Revolution. The book
Unpublished.
was unpublished.
We have to find this. Okay, I'm gonna track down that unpublished document. That sounds fascinating. And why don't you read as well? Footnote
Yeah, that sounds.
We didn't read as well.
51. Yeah, I think that footnote 51 was truly fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay. The children of Morgan bankers Thomas Lamont and Willard Straight, Corliss Lamont and Michael Straight, became the most infamous financier of the communist movements in the West. Meanwhile, Papa Lamont ran the financial looting of China together with his British counterpart, Sir Charles Addis, while Papa Straight hired Dewey to write for his journal, The New Republic, in support of British Morgan strangulation of credit to China. That's simply brilliant from oligarchical standpoint, of course. Okay, so by the age of, continuing the section on Hu Shi, by the age of 15, was already a firm advocate of empiricism against the scientific method of Mencius and Chu Si. He explicitly adopted Wang Yangming's contention that human nature was neither good nor evil, against the view of Mencius and Chu Si that man is fundamentally good. Mencius, he maintained, did not understand modern objective science. He studied with Dewey at Columbia from 1915 to 1917, then spent 2 more years, 1919 to 1921, touring China as Dewey's translator and advocate, demonstrating his grasp of British cultural warfare, who argued that there were but two methods of thought for modern times: pragmatism and dialectical materialism. As Sun Yat-sen has already demonstrated, these two methods were fundamentally equivalent, both materialist in nature, both rejecting any effective connection between human creative mentation and progress in society, who promoted Rousseau's Our Scientific Knowledge, a purely mechanical and statistical description of phenomena in which truth exists only at the whim of the individual. Truth is created by and for the use of man, wrote Hu. An idea which has fruitful consequences was called truth in the past. If it has been useful, it is still called truth today. And it reminds a little bit of the third stage, of the second stage of Plato, conventional truth, pistis. Who also adopted Wang Yanming's famous slogan that knowledge and action are one. Sun Yat-sen recognized the extreme danger of such pragmatism. In his 1918 book, The Psychological Reconstructions of China, called Memoirs of a Chinese Revolutionary in English translation, Sun focused his anti-polemic upon the idea that knowledge is primary, over, and far more difficult than action. Once knowledge is achieved, he argued, action will follow easily. He specifically blamed the collapse of the 1911 revolution on the pragmatic mentality of the Chinese people, who failed to act precisely because they lacked knowledge. Quote, mind is the beginning of everything that happens in the world. The overthrow of the monarchy was carried out by the mind. The construction of the republic was delayed and later brought to naught by the same mind. Just at the point of victory of the Chinese Revolution, the revolutionaries themselves became slaves of the theory of the difficulty of action and the easiness of knowledge. End of quote. Hu Shi continued Dewey and Russell's work in China throughout his life. In 1923, he wrote Science and Philosophy of Life, which codified the empiricist beliefs structure, a virtual declaration of war on the Confucian and Platonic moral tradition. Always referencing science as his basis of proof, he itemized his rejection of universal truth and his advocacy of moral relativism. These included, quote, on the basis of biological and historical knowledge, we should recognize that morality and religion are subject to change, and that the causes of such change can be scientifically discovered. End of quote. Oh, sorry. New quote. On the basis of biological, physiological, and psychological sciences, we should recognize that man is only one species in the animal kingdom and differs from the other species only in degree, but not in kind. End of quote. New quote. On the basis of biological sciences, we should recognize the terrific wakefulness and brutality in the struggle for existence in the biological world, and consequently the untenability of the hypothesis of a benevolent ruler who possesses the character of loving life. End of quote. Who made his attack on Confucianism into a campaign using his influence as a professor at Beijing University and as the famous spokesman for John Dewey to demand the overthrow of Confucius and Sons. The Chinese must not blame British imperialism for their sorry state, who insisted. They must blame the 3,000-year tradition of Confucianism. He created the new culture movement based upon the recognition that the old culture of China is not suitable to a modern situation. In his diatribes against Confucianism, he carefully singled out the tradition of Mencius and Chu Si as objects of attack rather than the Aristotelians Xun Zi and Wang Yangming. In 1927, a few years after Sun Yat-sen's death, Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, Sun's Nationalist Party finally unified the country under the leadership of Sun's close collaborator, Chiang Kai-shek, who was absolutely livid about the veneration of Sun Yat-sen and his three principles by the new Republican government. In 1929, in an essay entitled The New Culture Movement and the Kuomintang being the party named Nationalist Party by Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, who wrote, quote, "One of the great undertakings of the new culture movement was the liberation of thought. When we criticize Confucius and Mencius, impeach Cheng Yi and Chu Si, oppose the Confucian religion and deny God, purpose was to overthrow the canons of orthodoxy, to Chinese thought, and to encourage a skeptical attitude and a critical spirit. But now you may deny God, but you may not criticize Sun Yat-sen. You need not go to church, but you must fail to read Sun's last will and testament, nor to observe the weekly memorial service." End of quote. Well, he has a certain talent for irony, that's for sure. Continuing, what Hu Shi despised was not the formality of the rites venerating Sun Yat-sen, but the content of those rites, imbuing Chinese education and social life with Sun's scientific and cultural optimism. Nonetheless, Hu Shi supported Chiang Kai-shek nationalists rather than the communists, and went on to become China's ambassador to the US during World War II. He was the primary contact between China and the ultra-conservative China lobby in the US, perpetuating the myth that Sun Yat-sen was some variety of communist. After all, if he was not a pragmatist, he must have been a dialectical materialist, which misconception persists till today. The second case, Lu Xun. Lu Xun was educated in Japan at the turn of the century, becoming acquainted not only with the standard yet full translation of the Enlightenment empiricists, but also the radical nihilisms of Nietzsche and several Russian writers influenced by Nietzsche. He became the literary voice of the May 4th movement, heralded by the foreign community and by the iconoclasts of the left. His short stories were hateful diatribes against both classical Chinese culture and the cultural optimism of Sun Yat-sen. His most famous story, The True Story of AQ, is a parody on the Chinese Revolution of 1911. IQ, the Q being the English letter Q, was Lusun Chinese everyman, John Doe, if you want, representing both the unschooled masses and China as a whole. He is not only illiterate, but a virtual idiot, very capable of simple sense perception, and governed entirely by impulse and base emotion. His life as a servant, a petty thief, and the subject of constant scorn is meant to symbolize China's place in the world, brought upon itself by subservience to the Confucian rites. But the revolution of Sun Yat-sen is merely more of the same, argued Lu Xun. The revolutionary leader is caricatured as a privileged man, educated in Hong Kong and Japan, who merely cut off his pigtails. The Qing dynasty required every Chinese to wear a pigtail, and became an imitation foreign devil. Following the 1911 revolutions, these imitation foreign devils proceed to replicate the foreigners' oppression, and AQ, after being rejected in his effort to join the revolutionaries, is executed arbitrarily as an example to the masses to follow the new leaders. Lu Xun became the champion of Nietzsche in China and drew his inspiration directly from Nietzsche's words. God is dead, cried Nietzsche, Madman, in a chapter of The Gay Science. Nietzsche continues, quote, God remains dead and we have killed him. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves? God was the holiest and most powerful of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must not we ourselves become gods simply to seem worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever would be born after us, for the sake of this deed, he would be part of a higher history than all history hitherto. End of quote. When his audience stands mute in astonishment, Nietzsche, Madman, lives in disgust. I came too early, he says. My time has not come yet. End of quote. Lu Xun's first famous story, published in 1918, was titled A Madman's Diary. As in Nietzsche's story, Lu Xun's Madman is the harbinger of truth before a disbelieving public. Lu's madman is certain that his neighbors are out to kill him, but the crime 20 years before of trading on Mr. Kuju's account sheets. Kuju means ancient time, and the account sheets refer to the rites, reflecting the view that the rites are nothing more than rules of conduct. The madman then discovers that his persecutor intend to eat him. Virtually everyone is a cannibal, thought to be so by their ancestors through the ancient times account sheets. The madman reviews the Confucian classics himself to confirm his suspicion. Quote, scrawled all over each page are the words, quote within quote, virtue and morality. Since I could not sleep anyway, I read intently half the night until I began to see words between the lines, the whole book being filled with the two words, eat people, end of quote. Yes? Okay, eventually.
Yeah, I'm just getting a vision of the guy
the
who was
madman. Yeah, exactly. A nightmare.
Yeah.
Eventually, the madman realizes that it is his older brother who is leading the conspiracy to eat him. Respecting one's older brother is a central point of Confucian ethics. He further discovers that these Confucian cannibals prefer not to kill, but to set traps everywhere to force me to kill myself or to be frightened or worried to death. Lu Xun, madman, concludes his story. Quote, I have only just realized that I have been living all these years in a place where for 4,000 years they have been eating human flesh. Perhaps they are still children who have not eaten man. Save the children. End of quote. There emerged from the May 4 movement a core group of Nietzscheans, several of whom joined the Communist Party. One is Li Shuzhen transferred Nietzsche attack on Christianity directly to an attack on Chuxi. Quote, the famous sayings and ancient teachings of China honor reason rather than desire, and regard human desire as subordinate to heavenly principle, regardless of the fact that there could be no heavenly principle apart from human desire. So the old values must be forcefully destroyed. End of quote. Following the Cultural Revolution, several articles were published identifying the abuses of the Gang of Four with the reign of terror under the Nazis in Germany and tracing their ideology to Nietzsche. A 1980 issue of the Journal of the Chinese Academy of Social Science published a study of Nietzsche and voluntarism. It claimed that the ultra-leftists in the Cultural Revolution had been influenced by Nietzsche and his supporters in China to disregard the objective laws of social and economic development, and Nietzsche was thus discredited along with the Gang of Four. But as we shall see, Nietzsche was to make a comeback in the 1980s.
Okay.
Third and last case. Do we go to the third and last case?
I think at this point we're so close to the end, guys. I feel like we should probably finish it. Do we have time? I mean, are people okay for another 20 minutes of reading? Or should we just finish it in another session?
I'm good to continue. I mean, there's not that much left.
Yeah. Okay, let's try to push it through the next 5 pages.
Okay, so the third and last case, Liangshu Ming, London's last Confucian. The English language biography of Liangshu Ming by Harvard affiliate Guy Alito is called The Last Confucian, Liangshu Ming, and the Chinese Dilemma of Modernity. That Harvard should embrace Liangshu Ming is itself strong evidence that Liang is at best a Confucian in the tradition of Sun Tzu and Wang Yangming. Harvard was undoubtedly most enamored of Liangshu Ming, owing to his embrace of the anti-rationalist and pragmatic ideology of Rousseau and Dewey. Liang's subsequent relationship with Mao Zedong is most instructive as evidence of British ideological influence on Maoist China. Liang was one of the earliest of the Chinese students who received virtually no education in the classics. He attended a foreign style primary school in Beijing and was further introduced as a teenager to Jeremy Bentham's hedonistic calculus and the Russian anarchists. He joined Sun Yat-sen's Revolutionary Alliance in 1910 and the Nationalist Party after the revolution in 1911, but he suffered a mental collapse in 1912. He spent 4 years as a recluse at his father's home, studying Buddhism, emerging as a major voice in the Buddhist revival during the turbulent years of World War I. As a professor of Buddhist studies at Beijing University, Liang became close friends with Hu Shi and the radical students who went on to found the Communist Party in 1921, by the way. He was introduced to Western thought by Chang Shengfu, known as the leading Chinese interpreter of Bertrand Russell and an authority on dialectical materialism. He studied Yan Fu's translation of John Stuart Mill, Huxley, and collaborators, as well as the works of Henry Bergson, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. His Buddhist writings of that period quoted liberally from these empiricists and existentialists. In 1921, Liangshu Ming decided to convert to Confucianism from Buddhism. However, his Confucianism was based on that of the pseudo-Buddhist Wang Yangming and more revealing on that of Wang Yangming's radical follower Wang Keng. Wang Keng was a populist, often identified with the most extreme Wine-Cat Zen school of Buddhism. He preached that the way, the Tao, was that which corresponded to the everyday common needs of the people, and that man must follow the lead of ignorant men and women. Scholarship and Chuxi's dedication to the investigation of the principle of things was replaced by populist revival rallies, feel-good Confucianism with Taoist and Zen Buddhist went on. The theme was sageness for the masses. The relevance of this for the madness of the great proletarian cultural revolution is apparent. In Liangshu Ming's 1921 book, Eastern and Western Culture, he placed himself formally in the Confucian school, opposed to the overtly anti-Confucius sentiments of Hu Shi's New Culture movement. But the underlying premises of both camps were the same. An unbridgeable divide was constructed between a scientific view of the universe and a spiritual view, and between the spirits of different races and cultures. Liang wrote, quote, Really, how can one fundamental spirit be combined with the fundamental spirit with another culture? End of quote. He divided the world into three distinct cultural types. The Western, which is characterized by the unbridled will to satisfy the material, primal needs of man as an animal. Meaning, Hobbes and his followers represent the West. Secondly, China, which addresses the emotional inner needs of man in harmony with nature, meaning China is Taoist. And thirdly, India, which considers the world to be an illusion, seeking enlightenment in the negation of the will, the Buddhist. This division of the world into different, racially defined, mutually exclusive categories has served colonial interests well throughout history, as it does today's new colonialists, as seen in Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. Such is the deconstruction of the idea of one human race created in the image of God with the power of reason. Liangshu Ming incorporated wholesale the Rousseauite view of the European Renaissance. The Renaissance, he said, was not the flowering of the Platonic Christian view of mankind's creative power over nature, but the beginning of the overthrow of that moral outlook by one of pure selfishness. It was this selfish view of man, he argued, which was further advanced by the Enlightenment. The development of modern science was credited to this hedonistic worldview. Liang studied Russell's work intensely. He referred to Russell as the Western scholar who was most like Confucius. Most interesting in light of Russell's overt ridicule of Confucius. Liang identified with Russell both for his glorification of the Taoist tradition, but for his attacks on Western rationalism. Liang leaned even more on John Dewey, whose pragmatism was coherent with the populism of Wang Yangming and Wang Keng, making knowledge subservient to action, precisely the subject of Sun Yat-sen's attack on Wang Yangming, was the basis of Dewey's assault on classical education, an assault which Liangshu Ming continued with devastating effect in China. He became a leading proponent of radical school reforms, replacing classical education with practical learning. The goal was not creativity nor moral excellence, but a reasonable life, wrote Liang. He wanted his students to, quote, make their lives the lives of the common folk, end of quote. His motto was Tao Xing Zhi, Dewey's foremost student in experimental education. In the 1920s, Tao had set up an experimental rural school based on Dewey's concepts that education is life and education is society. There were no formal classes. The students worked in the fields daily and participated in rural village life, made their own clothes, etc. As Liang described it, quote, however life is, so should education be. However one does things, so does he learn. End of quote. Although Tao and Liang both spoke of developing intellectual ability, it was not the study of classical philosophic ideas nor scientific investigation, but the glorification of communalism and rural simplicity as intellectual, as Lance described it. Quote, intellectual ability, they learn themselves, they act themselves, and so obtain real learning. End of quote. The intelligentsia were described as parasites, alienated from the masses, another theme which would become a mainstay of the Cultural Revolution. In 1927, Liang had a self-described awakening in which he said, I repudiated the whole line of Western gadgetry and was not again infected with any desire for them. End of quote. He did not restrict his anti-technology prescription to individuals seeking enlightenment. He believed that China should not and could not become a modern nation. He wrote, quote, Chinese society is a village society. The entity known as China is nothing more than 300,000 villages. End of quote. As in the madness of the Cultural Revolution, Liang argued that the new China would emerge from the peasants who would create new customs and mores, and that parasitical intellectuals should learn from the peasantry. Liangshu Ming established a rural reconstruction institute in Shandong province in 1931 in connection with Tao Xingzhi School. During the 1930s, most of the Shandong province, including the local governments at the village level, was under the influence of Liang's institute. Before the 1930s, Liang kept his distance from the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, considering himself an opponent to violence. But he saw a great turning point in the CCP with Mao Zedong take over of the party and the turn away from the cities for the countryside and the peasantry. In 1938, he traveled to Mao's headquarters in the caves of Yan'an. The two had a meeting of the minds, spending many hours together in discussion. Liang left Yan'an, full of admiration for the great helmsman. In the 1940s, Liang was involved in third force political parties, independent from but supportive of the CCP. Following the 1949 revolution, he was named a delegate to the First People Political Consultative Conference. In the early 1950s, Mao maintained frequent contact with Liang, including private meetings discussing education, communalization, and philosophy. However, Liang vigorously and publicly attacked the New People's Republic for adopting the Soviet model of industrialization. He argued that Mao was being betrayed, and in turn, the people were being betrayed as the revolution entered the cities and forgot the villages. Mao exploded against Liang Shuming, denouncing him publicly in 1953 for attempting to undermine the industrialization of China. In 1955, Mao launched a campaign against Hushi and Western liberalism, which Liang Shuming included as a feudal counterpart to Hushi's liberalism. Nonetheless, Liang never lost his position in the People's Political Consultative Conference. Although he gave a self-criticism in 1956, his opposition to the Soviet model became acceptable after the Soviets pulled out of China in the late 1950s. His rabbit, back to the land, anti-intellectualism would become national policy during the Cultural Revolution. All the schools were closed so that children could learn by doing, by working in peasant communes, or by forming murderous gangs to humiliate and torture their teachers and government officials. Intellectuals became the stinking ninth category in the gang of four subdivisions of the population according to revolutionary fitness, occupying the bottom position just after prostitutes. Yeah. Just after. It was Bertrand Russell's dream come true. Children were turned against their parents. Confucianism was denounced as an evil feudal ideology, and society devolved to anarchy.
Just quickly, Quan.
Yeah.
For anybody, I'm not too familiar with the break of the Soviet Union and China, because formerly they were allies and the Soviets were helping China, like he said, to industrialize. And then there was a break. And I know it had to do with nuclear issues, but can you remind me in brief what was the cause of that break?
I think that it's twofold. Okay, I think first it was the ego of Mao Zedong, because when Stalin died in 1953, and that Khrushchev made the famous speech of denouncing Stalin, Mao considered Khrushchev as a revisionist, and Mao wanted to have the mantle of the leader in the communist world. Okay, I think that one of the element was Mao's ego. The other element was more objective, and I think that it was a transfer of the nuclear technology to the Chinese, and the Russian were hesitant to transfer everything. And as you probably know, the first atomic bomb by the Chinese has been created in 1964. So the Chinese took about 4 to 5 years to finish what the Soviet did not transfer to them.
Okay. Okay, and the Soviets were uncomfortable also with the idea of China having the bomb at that point, or what?
Yes. I think that it's the true it's the true geopolitical reality one. But
Okay.
once again, I believe a little bit in the psychological explanation too, in that Mao wanted the mantle of leadership of the communist world.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
No problem. A most interesting conclusion to the Liangshu Ming story occurred in 1977. After the death of Mao and the arrest of the Gang of Four, Deng Xiaoping and his allies were re-establishing order and rehabilitating the millions of Chinese who had been officially disgraced during the Cultural Revolution. The Gang of Four were put on trial and condemned, but the new leadership was cautious in their appraisal of Mao. He was publicly accused of making severe errors during the Great Leap Forward in 1958 and the Cultural Revolution, essentially between 1966 and 1969, even if officially it has ended in 1977. But his legacy as the great helmsman and father of the revolution was retained. Deng's group chose to publish a fifth volume of Mao's works, the first such new publication in 17 years, selecting those writings which reflected Mao's support for science and technology and opening up to the West the policies Deng would pursue in the reform. Among the selection chosen for this volume were Mao's early 1950 uncompromising attacks on Liangshu Ming, denouncing the anti-Western and anti-science backwardness of Liang's outlook.
Cool. Thank you. All right, so it is now 9:15, and yeah, I think, Cynthia, if you want to round out the last section, you can get this thing done in like 3 pages.
Yeah, I can close it out if you want.
Go ahead, Nick. No, I'm tired.
You're tired? Okay, Cynthia's tired. Okay, all right, do it.
Cool. The construction of China. One of the first policies implemented by Deng Xiaoping after the arrest of the Gang of Four was the assertion of the primacy of science and technology for the construction of a modern nation. In March 1978, he called a Science and Technology Conference, which set the tone. The People's Republic of China's commitment to science and technology had never been totally discarded, even in the darkest days of the Cultural Revolution. Following the 1949 revolution, a large number of Chinese scientists who had been working abroad responded to the call from their homeland to return and build a new China. This included physicists who had worked in close collaboration with many of the leading scientists of the early 20th century, including the nuclear physicists Frédéric and Irène Joliot-Curie in France, Lise Meitner in Germany, and Max Born in Scotland. It also included Qian Shuzhen, the closest associate of Theodore von Karman at the California Institute of Technology, who was one of the crucial architects of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, an American's rocket program of the 1940s. Ironically, Chan was driven out to the US by the McCarthy witch hunts in the early 1950s. He went on to become the father of the Chinese rocket and space programs. When the recurring anti-bourgeois intellectual campaigns were launched in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the scientists were generally protected from the class struggle vilification suffered by the rest of the intelligentsia. This was partly the result of Mao's determination to develop a nuclear capability, a feat that was successfully accomplished despite the total pullout of Russian support after 1960. Deng's Science and Technology Conference was intended to both re-establish and expand China's scientific capacity, while also mobilizing the population in support of the effort. A second such conference was held in 1995 at the point that the financial deregulation and speculation was threatening to undermine the development process. Deng also revived Confucian studies. Bo Yibo, who together with Zhu Enlai had been the vice premier responsible for the nuclear physics work before he was removed and disgraced by the Gang of Four, was rehabilitated and ran a campaign to revive the Confucian classics. The Cultural Revolution was an expression of extreme Aristotelianism, not only dividing science from morality, but imposing an artificial moral construct of class purity, which was without any means of measure in the real universe, i.e., beyond good and evil, in Nietzsche's phrase. As he launched the reform, Deng adopted the slogan, "Practice is the sole criterion of truth." His intention, a necessary one, was to ground political policy in reality, where it could be judged and evaluated according to the effect on the well-being and progress of the nation. Deng's views and policies reflected an abundance of caution against the cult of the individual promoted by Lin Piao and the Gang of Four, which had allowed tyranny to masquerade as idealism, promoting the selfless communist man whose self-perception was a cog in a machine, while denouncing all independent thinking as a treasonous attack on the state. Footnote 58. The Think Like Li Peng campaign during the Cultural Revolution glorified a mindless but totally dedicated low-level party cadre who literally described himself as a cog in a machine. However, Deng's slogan, "Practice is the sole criterion of truth," was borrowed from the Han Studies school of the 18th century, not from Confucius, Mencius, or Zhu. If practice is measured by the long-term growth in social rates of scientific and cultural progress, as in LaRouche's relative potential population density metric, then Deng's slogan becomes an expression of a Platonic Confucian search for truth. But if, as is often the case, practice is viewed as a justification for action over knowledge, as in the pragmatism of Wang Yangming or John Dewey, then a caution sign must be raised. While China has responded enthusiastically to the end of ideological tyranny, such pragmatism in the long term cannot fulfill the passion of man's soul to seek truth in the coherence of creative human reason and the lawfulness of the universe. The recurring outbursts of the 1980s, resulting in the disaster of Tiananmen Square in June of 1989, must be seen in that light. See the appendix. As Lyndon LaRouche observed at the time, the eyes of the youth who filled Tiananmen Square revealed that they were searching for their souls, souls which had been lost somewhere in the chaos of their youth, in the throes of the Cultural Revolution. Footnote 59. At the time of the Tiananmen events of 1989, Lyndon LaRouche and the author were political prisoners sharing a cell block in the Alexandria, Virginia County Jail. We watched the unfolding tragedy in China on the cell block television. The author is still incarcerated in the Virginia prison system, serving a 77-year sentence for his political beliefs.
Yeah, at the time, just to point out, I don't think the full truth of the false flag of Tiananmen Square was something that Mike had discovered yet. Maybe I think he had presumed that there was more to the story than met the eye by Western press, but I think a lot of those realities only came about later on.
Right. I'll continue. Such a search is the essence of human nature, but when left unmoored by moral purpose, can be easily turned against itself. The demonstrations were filled with references to the rich moral tradition of both East and West, the sayings of Confucius, the three principles of Sun Yat-sen, quotes from Abraham Lincoln, and the music of Beethoven played on the loudspeaker system. But the opposite tendency towards anarchy and libertarianism was also present. It has been widely discussed, footnote 60, is that one worth? Nah. That the cooler heads among the leadership of the demonstrations were attempting to end the occupation of the square after the government arranged official meetings with their spokesman. However, the young hunger strikers, goaded on by the world's press, took over the strike process, preventing any resolution. This Jacobin tendency was even more evident in the case of one young intellectual, Xiaobo, whose story is particularly relevant to our primary subject. As even the hunger strikers were reaching exhaustion and the demonstrations appeared ready to end peacefully, Xiaobo flew into Beijing from the US, where he was a visiting scholar at Columbia University. He linked up with a popular rock star, moved into Tiananmen Square, and with the world's media at his command, announced a new hunger strike by the two of them. Who is this Xiaobo? During the 1980s, Lui established himself as the Lu Xun of modern China, as none other than the popularizer of Nietzsche and Heidegger. In his book, Critique of China, published in 1988 and sold out through several editions, Lui linked Leninism with Confucianism, calling for a violent break from both. He wrote, quote, "Theory of evolution and symbols of suffering. Nietzsche was the smasher of idols, the symbol of individual freedom. In contemporary China, Liangshu style extremism and ruthlessness is especially needed, especially in dialogue with traditional culture. The government leadership, which had thorough intelligence on the identities of the leading demonstrators, saw in Xiaobo and others a revival of the Nietzschean, violently anti-Confucius, anti-party and anti-authority fanaticism of the Cultural Revolution's Red Guards, and finally gave up on any potential for a peaceful resolution. Well, of course. Loy's overt attack on rationality, in particular, stirred memories of the Gang of Four's denunciation of intellectuals as the ninth stinking category. Loy said Chinese intellectuals carry three deeply rooted traditional values which poison their minds: anti-democratic populism, the Confucian personality, and the harmony of heaven and man. Another footnote, nothing. Loy Xiaobo borrowed these categories from a leading scholar, Li Seihu, who has been proudly identifying himself with the Frankfurt School since the 1960s. Li Seihu's critical works have attempted to discredit Zhu Xi, whose influence, Li writes, seriously poisoned the minds of the people in its several hundred years of dominance, leaving in its wake disasters and sorrows. The Nietzsche Revival in the mid-1980s helped to explain why the youth in Tiananmen Square could not find their souls, since Nietzsche had denied the soul's existence. Nazi philosopher Martin Heidegger was also promoted by Loy Xiaobo's cult of Nietzsche, as it was called. Heidegger was a follower not only of Nietzsche, but also of the Taoist tradition in China. He often quoted from the Taoist canon, Shuangzi, to support his belief that man was divided from all other living things by an unbridgeable divide, an abyss, and that love of neighbor is a pointless and impossible calling. He also admired Shuangzi's diatribes against technology. At the end of the war, when Heidegger had a mental breakdown related to his denazification process, he spent a summer working on a translation of another Taoist canon, Laozi's Tao Te Ching. Graham Parks, one of the Deconstructionists affiliated with Ames at the University of Hawaii, in his Heidegger and Asian Thought, has written that the problem with China's scholarship in the West is that it is vitiated by the tendency on the part of the early translators to translate into the language of traditional Platonic Christian metaphysics. The realization has dawned recently, however, that existentialism and phenomenology have developed philosophical terminologies that are far more in harmony with many strains of Asian thought. We would have to concede that a mentally deranged Nazi ideologue, such as Heidegger, may be in harmony with Taoist mystics, but certainly not with Asian thought. The present guided by the future. China in the 1990s has witnessed an explosion in cultural and technological optimism. While numerous great projects are proceeding across the country, the government is reaching out to its many old adversaries, Russia, the United States, India, Japan, with aggressive proposals for mutual development and collaboration. The leadership in the post-Deng era centered on President Jiang Zemin chose to sponsor a major celebration in 1997 on Sun Yat-sen's birthday. Just as Deng had carefully selected speeches by Mao from the 1950s attacking Liangshu Ming, so did Jiang Zemin choose quotes from Mao from the same 1950s era in which Mao praised Sun Yat-sen's passion for the development of China. More recently, a large portrait of Sun Yat-sen was raised in Tiananmen Square. In an interview with the French daily Le Figaro, Jiang Zemin said, quote, "China's development is a guarantee of peace and prosperity for our planet, and everyone should welcome it." This is the same sentiment which inspired Sun Yat-sen's The International Development of China. There are many problems, including especially the continuing corruption and cynicism of many Chinese who embraced the get-rich-quickly mentality of the mid-1980s. But the overriding outlook, evident everywhere, is the image of an increasingly prosperous and intellectually vibrant China. This optimism is contagious. It awakens the dormant optimism of people of goodwill throughout the globe. There can be no toleration of China's deconstruction, neither economically nor culturally, neither in China nor in the West. I will close with a quote from Beijing University professor Liangshu from a 1996 interview in the German magazine Ibycus. Now and then in China, a frustration overtakes many young people. Many are enthusiastic about the previous era, as if China under the ultra-left line of the Gang of Four had found itself in an idyllic paradise. One forgets that in this paradise, the fundamental material necessities were regulated in order to glorify ideology. One could only perform work with bound hands and think with shackled brain. This era is finally over. Since 1976, and above all since the early 90s, one can suddenly look around and breathe freely and naturally. A passing blind glorification of the material, even as brazen and arrogant as possible, is still a positive change compared to the hypocritical and deceitful spiritualism of the Gang of Four. A zeal for learning is noticeable among many, to be sure, coupled with pragmatic and career-oriented aims. In addition, the achievements in the field of natural sciences and modern high technology demonstrate the enormous capacity of the Chinese intelligentsia. The day will come where the intelligentsia will be fully recognized. Early in this century, the great patriot and founder of the new China, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, was enthusiastic about the building of the Eurasian land bridge. This noble idea was defined for current times by Mr. LaRouche, the co-founder of the Schiller Institute. I fully and completely agree with this far-sighted American statesman when he presents the building and completion of the Eurasian land bridge as one of the most important tasks of the 21st century. Through communication and cooperation, avoiding possible conflicts and confrontation, a renaissance will indeed begin. However, not the renaissance of Chinese culture in the sense of Chinese centrism, but a cultural and moral renaissance for mankind in which Europe and Asia alike contribute a great deal, and from which both cultural areas will equally profit.
Beautiful. And this again was 1997.
Yeah, like ages ago.
Very far-sighted. Yeah, ages ago.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah. The way he's almost like, he's just so accurate, isn't he? Like when we're looking at what's happening right now, the accuracy that he shows in the way he brings out these ideas. And even at the end there, it's a short snippet on the future, but he's got it down. Really,
yeah. And you can see too, like again, as we talked about during the first reading, a lot of time has been artificially lost because right after Mike Billington wrote this paper, this is when you had, or he wrote this in the midst of the attacks by George Soros on the Asian tiger economies, right?
that's when that crash is going on.
Yeah. And at the time when Soros was speculating against Myanmar and Thailand and Indonesia, and I mean, like 7 economies were just hammered by these currency attacks.
Yeah.
Mike Billington wrote a paper making the point that the real target was China, because China was in the midst of trying to do what they're doing now today, to go out with the Belt and Road, with the Eurasian land bridge approach, and develop and industrialize these economies.
Yeah.
It needed them to be stable, though, to have that environment. So, I mean, we lost a lot of time.
Yeah. I mean, like with America, with Kennedy as well. I mean, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Could have started there.
Yeah.
It's started now, so.
Exactly. It's keeping a lot of oligarchs up at night.
Yeah. Certainly is.
What was that, Quan? I saw you were going to say something.
Well, I said that one of the things that we should remind to ourselves very frequently, that the oligarchical class is quite brilliant in utilizing two apparently opposite ideology, but having the same foundation, like dialectical materialism and empiricism. And well, from a tactical point of view, it's simply brilliant because it works at each time.
Yeah.
Yeah, to the degree that people don't have they haven't followed Socrates' mandate to know thyself. To the degree that we haven't done that, we tend to fall prey very easily to these false dualisms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even.
But yeah. Well, what's happening in the States now? The Antifa and there's a strange sound. What is it?
Let's go water.
Silence. On the thing.
Background.
Yeah, there's background noise, isn't there?
Yeah. What is it? It's like a water. No. Yeah. It stops now. Yeah. Okay. Anyway. It's like in the States now. It's like the Antifa and the BLM, for example. It's the two apparent opposite groups.
Right. Yeah.
Antifa and BLM are two opposite groups?
No.
No. In appearance, not reality.
They look very similar to me, so maybe help me out. How in what way?
No, but they are opposite
like, how
in
would
the
a
same
naive
way
person say
that, no. Okay, but I would say that what make them similar is they want destruction, okay?
Right.
But they have ideological veneer that seems opposite, but the same thing reunite them in the desire to destroy. The same with empiricism opposed to dialectical materialism.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's the same play of the oligarchy in the States that we see now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the waterfall is back again. What
Yeah.
Yeah. What is it? That's. Oh wow! Wow.
Let me try something. I think Okay, I knew it.
Yeah.
Anyway, guys, I'm gonna jump off.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you guys. And so for the next reading session, I'm not too sure what I'm still thinking that a paper, one of the denser prison writings of Lyndon LaRouche might be a nice thing to work through. Maybe like on the subject of metaphor or LaRouche's an introduction to his science of economy, of physical economy. So I don't know. We'll see.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, we trust you for the selection.
Yeah, exactly. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, we're gonna read Amazing Spider-Man. It is.
Oh yes, thanks, Matt. Best class ever.
All right, cool.
Ciao.
Okay.
So I guess Sunday, Jonathan Tenenbaum on artificial intelligence, and we'll touch back with the reading next Wednesday.
Sweet.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye. Ciao.
Okay, see ya.
Night, Jerry.
Ciao.
Bye.